required the Prime Minister to express whether or not he had confidence in a particular minister's judgment. And that's an important constitutional matter in this country. If the Prime Minister loses confidence in a minister's judgment, that's a serious matter. And the only extent to which the Prime Minister has to answer this question is in relation to whether or not he has confidence in the judgment of a minister. But it can't be confined just to portfolio responsibilities, because the Prime Minister has a wider responsibility than that. And that's all I'm asking the Prime Minister to answer, not to get into detail of whether or not there was any particular cover-up or what constitutes a cover-up. That's irrelevant to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister's role. His role, he was questioned about whether or not he has, in my view, about whether or not he has confidence in a minister's judgment. And that is a matter for which the Prime Minister is responsible. And I would ask the Honourable Peter Dunn.
Sorry, Mr Speaker, I have no desire to prolong this any further, but there is an important issue that arises out of your comments in relation particularly to 14651. So you've made it very clear in the House this afternoon that the Prime Minister has a responsibility for the judgment of his ministers as well as for their particular actions. 14651 says the Prime Minister and ministers are responsible for only those matters that fall within their responsibilities as ministers, which on the face of it would appear to be a different emphasis. Now, sir, I appreciate the House is in very unusual territory, and I wonder whether the way through it might not be for you to give a considered ruling, not today but perhaps tomorrow, on this point, bearing in mind what 14651 says and the rulings that you've made in the House today, because this issue may well arise in the future, and I think it would be in everyone's interest to make sure we get it absolutely right at this point, because as things stand at the moment, it could be held that there is a contradiction between your ruling and the ruling that was in place previously.
I'll hear the Honourable Darren Hughes.
Speaker, I appreciate this is taking some time, but I hope you'll note it's not because the opposition is continuing to raise points of order. It seems to us, sir, that you have stated a position on 2 or 3 occasions now, which government ministers and ministers from support parties in the government who take ministerial warrants and are now trying to argue the way back from the ruling that you have given, makes it quite clear. If Mr Goff had been asking questions about Mr Garrett as a Member of Parliament, no questions will be ruled out of order. He's asking the Prime Minister questions about one of his ministers, regardless of what party they come from. It doesn't make it any worse or better that they're from a party that is not the National Party, but the Prime Minister retains responsibility for them. Part of our system which Mr Parker has gone through at the Cabinet Office manual means that when multiple parties make up an executive, they are still accountable to Parliament in exactly the same way. You've stated that you've given a ruling to us on this already, and we're being thwarted from the continuation of question time today by multiple points of order from the government.
I hear all members, and I would point out that had the to the Honourable Peter Dunn in relation to Speaker's ruling 1461, had the Prime Minister been questioned about 1465 had the Prime Minister been asked whether he agreed with the actions of Rodney Hyde as leader of the ACT Party, it would have been totally out of order. Or whether he agreed with the actions of Rodney Hyde, the Honourable Rodney Hyde as minister in his actions as leader of the ACT Party, that would be totally out of order. The Prime Minister is not responsible for the members or the minister's actions, as that Speaker's ruling points out. But that's not the substance of the question. The substance of the question is whether the Prime Minister has confidence in the judgment of a minister. And that is a slightly different question. But in the interest of making progress today, I'm very conscious that this is a very important issue. This boundary between the Prime Minister's role as Prime Minister and party responsibilities, ministers' roles. I accept fully this is a vexed area for responsibility, and rather than screw it up as Speaker, I'm prepared to give a more considered ruling, to give some further thought to the matter and take into consideration all the issues that have been raised. But I do make clear for the future, though, that Prime Ministers are responsible for the conduct of their ministers, and sometimes that's not easy. But I don't believe these Speaker's rulings have been referred to in any way relieve the Prime Minister of that responsibility. But I'm very happy to look at the matter further, and in the interests of making progress. And probably at that point, if I'm going to do that, I probably should abandon this question for today, because, I think that the dilemma is that I'm prepared. What I'll do is, so that I don't cost the opposition further on the matter, I'll listen to further questions, but clearly they can't follow exactly this track, because if I am to consider the matter further, as the House would appear to want me to do so, then the questions can't be exactly the same. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Point of order, David Parker. The Honourable David Parker.
Mr Speaker, the Opposition has put up with repeated challenges of your initial ruling. The Cabinet Manual is absolutely clear. The precedents are clear in respect to the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Right now. The member will resume his seat. I've indicated to the House I will give this matter serious consideration. Had that member been in the executive, he wanted the Speaker to do exactly the same thing, and I wouldn't mind betting he's never seen a Speaker push an executive this hard before. And I'm making it very clear to the House that I'll be making a very fair ruling on this thing. If I give it further thought, it won't be to let any Minister or Prime Minister escape from their responsibilities, but I won't have that sort of thing in the House today. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Point of order, the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
And look, I respect your view. There's a dilemma, though, we have, sir, and I accept in good grace what you're trying to do to give a definitive ruling. But, sir, how does a member, Mr Goff or other members' questioning proceed if they have very little guidance now as to what is in order to ask and what is not in order?
Order. The member's just taking further time of the House. What is very clear, if I rule on the matter, the issue's not gone away. When I give a fully considered ruling on the matter, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition will be able to pursue the matter with absolute clarity. But my concern is this is a hugely important issue, and I want to make sure that I don't blur boundaries or muddy waters, that when I make a definitive ruling on this matter, I've been sufficiently convinced that I run a risk perhaps of shifting the current boundary lines. Some would argue the Prime Minister already answered the question today. Now, if you want me to go down that track and say, OK, the Prime Minister already answered the question, let it all roll, but I'm not sure the questioner would have felt comfortable with that at all. In fact, the questioner raised a point of order about the Prime Minister's answer. So I could have just got off the hook by saying, OK, let's just keep going and treat that as an answer and ignore the point of order from the Honourable Member's own leader. But I take question time too seriously to allow that to happen. This is a serious matter, and I've got to make very clear this issue of the responsibility of the Prime Minister, so we don't have this problem in the future. Point of order, the Honourable Darren Speaker.
If we just go back to where we were before that last volley of points of order started, the Prime Minister had given a response to the Leader of the Opposition. The Leader of the Opposition took a point of order. He was not satisfied with that answer. You ruled in his favour. So we're still at the point when those points of order started where you'd said that the Prime Minister had the responsibility to answer his first supplementary before we go back to that. That's the first point, sir. The second point would be that we've sat and listened respectfully to the rulings that you have made, and we have not challenged that. We've sat and watched government ministers repeatedly get up and after you'd given a ruling be able to give very long points of order in response to what they'd said, and we want to support you in your role as Speaker and the reforms you're making to question time, but we do feel very uncomfortable that once you've given a ruling, repeated government ministers are able to stand and speak to that point of order at length and give the impression that has somehow altered the course of question time for that day. I think that would be a very bad impression to give, and I know it's not the one that has happened, but I think we've got to be very mindful of the fact that when the opposition sit back and support your ruling, what we don't want to see is ministers then abuse that by taking point of order after point of order. And I think the smirk on the Leader of the House's face gave the game away.
The member's now getting into dangerous territory. Order! Lucky I couldn't pick who was making the interjections then. I've said I'll give a considered... If the members don't want me to give a considered ruling on the matter, that's fine, but I've indicated to the House that I'll give a considered ruling on this matter because I sense it is so important. And if members agree with that, I'm inviting the Honourable Leader of the Opposition to ask further questions insofar as we're able to today, given that uncertainty around the way the standing orders and Speaker's rulings apply to this particular situation. But the last question I've got to accept as being given at the moment, unless if I'm going to consider the standing orders further, I've got to accept that last answer. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Point of order, the Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr. Speaker, I don't want to prolong things, but this is far too important for